Chapter 6, Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. This chapter builds on the previous two chapters covering supply and demand and elasticity. If you learn those chapters well, usually you will not have much difficulty with the material in Chapter 6. This chapter can usually be covered within 90 minutes of class time, so maybe a class and a half. And in this video lecture, I've combined the analysis of price ceilings with a rent control example, and I've also combined the analysis of price floors with a minimum wage example. In contrast, the textbook presents a generic analysis of price ceilings, then an analysis of rent control using an example, followed by a generic analysis of price floors, and then finally the minimum wage. So the order is a little different in this video lecture than in the text. However, if you are able to go through both and understand the core concepts, you're going to be doing okay. Most students learn new concepts better in the context of a specific examples, like in this video, rather than generic analysis anyway. So hopefully combining them down will save time. So government policies that alter private market outcome. There's a couple we're going to look at. Price controls and taxes. Under price controls, we have a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum on the price of a good or service. An example would be rent control. It's an artificial ceiling on the amount that you can charge for rent. So a price ceiling limits the maximum price of a good or service. And a price floor is a legal minimum on the price of a good or service, like labor, which an example would be minimum wage. Taxes, the government can make buyers or sellers pay a specific amount on each unit. We will use supply and demand. We use the supply and demand model to see how each policy affects the market outcome. The price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive and the equilibrium quantity. So we're going to see what happens with the supply and demand model when you introduce a price ceiling, and if you introduce a price floor, and if you have a tax. So example 1, we start by analyzing the effects of a price ceiling. The most common example of a price ceiling is rent control. It's typically seen in more urban areas. So we're going to do this analysis in the context of a rent control example. We begin by showing the market for apartments in equilibrium before the government imposes any sort of price controls. We see supply and demand here, and where equilibrium falls, we have an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. The equilibrium price is $800, and the quantity of apartments provided is 300. And again, this is the equilibrium without price controls. So how does a price ceiling affect market outcomes? A price ceiling above the equilibrium is non-binding. It's not binding. It has no effect on the market outcome because the equilibrium occurs below the price ceiling. Here, the price ceiling, the rent control is saying, hey, rent can't be more than $1,000 a month. But the market has already determined it's going to be $800 a month and 300 units, so there's no issue there. Pardon me, go back here. When some students see this for the first time, they wonder why the price ceiling does not result in a surplus. When the price ceiling is above the equilibrium price is still perfectly legal. Just because landlords are allowed to charge $1,000 in rent doesn't mean that they will be able to. If they do, they won't be able to rent their apartments at all, and a surplus would result, causing downward pressure on the price, and we'd move back towards equilibrium anyway. There's no law that prevents the price, in this case rent, from falling. So it does fall until surplus is gone and equilibrium is reached. So here the equilibrium again would be at price 800 and quantity 300. Now, how price ceilings affect market outcomes in terms of if the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price. So the equilibrium price of 800 is above the ceiling and therefore illegal. The government's saying, hey, you can't charge more than $500 a month. The ceiling is a binding constraint. Before it was not binding, now it is a binding constraint on price, causing a shortage. In this case, like I said, the price ceiling is binding, In the new equilibrium with the price ceiling, the actual price of rent of an apartment is $500. It won't be more than that because any higher price is illegal. It'll be less than 500 because the shortage would be even larger if the price were lower. So it's going to go all the way up to the ceiling because it's below the equilibrium. So they're going to maximize all they can get, and what's going to result is a supply over here at 250 and a demand at 400. So you're going to have a shortage. The actual quantity of apartments rented equals 250, and the shortage equal to 150, which is the difference between quantity demanded 400 and the quantity supplied 250. So generally, as a renter, you're like, "Yay, price ceilings is going to help me out here. I'm not going to have to pay as much in rent." But what the market's going to dictate is you're going to have a shortage of apartments, and you may have a hard time finding an apartment. In the long run, supply and demand are more price elastic, so the shortage is larger. Okay, so in this slide, you'll see the equilibrium price is still 800 and price ceiling still 500. That's the same scenario as the preceding slides, but supply and demand are more price elastic than before. You can see they're a little more flatter, and the shortage that results from the binding price ceiling is larger. So we went from having a shortage of around 150 to now 300 apartments. So the price ceiling over time, the shortage only grows greater. There's more demand and there's less supply because you can't get the what the market dictates for a price. So in shortages, in rationing, with a shortage, the sellers must ration the goods among buyers. Some rationing mechanisms include long lines. We've all seen that in different situations. Price ceilings can do that. Limitations on supply can cause long lines. And then discrimination according to the seller's biases. These mechanisms are often unfair and inefficient, and the goods that are supposed to be provided do not necessarily go to the buyers who value them the most highly, because it doesn't go at the market price. In contrast, when prices are not controlled, the rationing mechanism is efficient. The goods go to buyers that value them most highly, and it's pretty impersonal and thus fair. So the last two bullets discuss what we call efficiency in the context of rationing goods to those buyers who value them most highly. This concept will be explored further in the following chapter. We're going to talk a lot more about the economic efficiency concept. So the second example we're going to look at, we're going to switch gears and look at the effects of a price floor. We illustrate this concept using a common textbook example, which is minimum wage. This may be the first time you've seen supply and demand diagram in terms of a labor market. It's useful to note that the price of labor is simply the wage, which we measure on the vertical axis of our supply and demand diagram. Along the horizontal axis, we measure the quantity of labor, the number of workers. The demand for unskilled labor comes from firms, and the supply comes from workers. We focus on unskilled labor because the minimum wage is usually not relevant to higher skilled, higher wage workers. A price floor below the equilibrium price is not binding. So the effect on it has no effect on the market outcome. You can see here that the price floor, they're not going to allow you to pay anything less than, say, $5 an hour. But the market's already determining, in this example, $6 an hour, so there's no problem. You may, for some reason, wonder why the $5 price does not cause a shortage. After all, at the wage of $5, the quantity of unskilled workers that firms wish to hire exceeds the quantity of unskilled workers that are looking for jobs because it's such low pay. But the minimum wage law does not stop the wage from rising above $5 in this example. So in response to this shortage, the wage will rise until the shortage disappears. If it were at $5, it would rise to that equilibrium of $6, which occurs at the equilibrium wage of $6. The equilibrium wage is perfectly legal when a price floor, i.e. the minimum wage, is below it. So this is a situation where the market is perfectly legal because the equilibrium is above the minimum wage. Now, in a much more realistic example, the equilibrium wage of $6 as determined by the market is below the floor. It's therefore illegal. The floor is a binding constraint on wage and causes a surplus. In other words, unemployment. Now the minimum wage exceeds equilibrium wage. The equilibrium wage, because $7.25 is higher than $6, what the market wants to pay, the equilibrium wage, any wage below $7.25 is illegal because of the price floor. In this case, the actual wage will be $7.25. It will not be lower because any lower wage is illegal. It will not be higher because at any higher wage, the surplus would be even greater. And the actual number of unskilled workers with jobs equates to 400. 550 want jobs at $7.25, but firms are only willing to hire 400, leaving a surplus. In other words, an unemployment total of 150 workers. The surplus of anything, especially labor, represents wasted resources. So the supply of labor, willing workers, is 550. The demand for workers at the higher cost to firms is 400. You have 150 people that are willing to work and unable to. That's your unemployment. So the minimum wage, minimum wage laws do not affect highly skilled workers. They do not affect, they do affect teen workers. Teen workers are generally considered low skill because they don't have a lot of formal training and job skills. Studies have shown that a 10% increase in the minimum wage raises teen unemployment by 1 to 3%. So empirical work shows that supply, willingness to work at a minimum wage, if it's above what the market demand for that wage is, will exceed the demand for it, resulting in unemployment. So let's work through an example. Price controls. We're going to work through three things here. Determine the effects of a $90 price ceiling, a $90 price floor, and a $120 price floor. So we're just going to go through three examples here with a ceiling and two price floors. The price, let's say in this situation, you see your supply and demand here, equilibrium here looks like 100 would be the price. Let's say the price falls to 90 due to a price ceiling. Price is limited to 90, it can't go up to 100. What's going to happen, and this again is the, I believe the hotel room example. Buyers demand 120 rooms. Here's your demand, 120. That's where that price crosses the demand line. And this is where price crosses the supply at 90. So hotels are willing to supply 90 rooms, but consumers want 120. So we have a shortage of 30. Now looking at the second example, a $90 price floor. Equilibrium price is above the floor, so the floor is not binding, so it doesn't affect. Price is 100 and rooms provided is 100. So the price floor actually didn't affect the market outcome here. Now looking at the third example, the $120 price floor. The price rises to $120. The government's saying, hey, you can't, this product has to be sold for this amount, or hotel rooms have to be charged, you have to charge at least $120 as a minimum rate. Buyers will demand only 60 rooms because it's a higher price than what they normally would pay. It's $20 higher than what the market would normally say the room is worth. And sellers would say, hey, we're making a lot more money, I am willing to supply 120 rooms. Well, you have a surplus of 60 rooms. So it's so funny. These are very basic economic concepts, yet being a policy economist, I can tell you that many folks at the local, state, and federal level simply just do not understand these graphs when they put in things like price floors and price ceilings. They're a little more prevalent than you might realize. So we can evaluate these price controls. Recall from the basic principles listed in Chapter 1 that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Prices are signals that guide the allocation of society's resources. This allocation is altered when policymakers restrict prices. Price controls often intend to help the poor, but often hurt more than they help. They're usually well-intentioned and then cause damages. The last bullet says, price controls generally hurt the poor more than they help them. We've seen this that the minimum wage can cause job losses and rent control can reduce the quantity and quality of affordable housing. Both policies make poor worse off. Our analysis has been in the context of the world without market failures. Subsequent chapters we're going to look at will introduce situations in which government intervention can improve on market outcomes. That's possible. However, in such cases, the appropriate policy is usually something other than a direct price control. So let's take a look at taxes. The government levies taxes on many goods and services to raise revenue, to pay for national defense, public schools, etc., etc. The government can make buyers and sellers pay the tax, and the tax can be a percent of a good's price or a specific amount for each unit sold. So for simplicity, we analyze per unit taxes only. So let's take a look at an example. So let's take a pretty simple example to illustrate a tax. First of all, let's look at equilibrium for the market for pizza without a tax. Equilibrium price is $10. Equilibrium quantity is 500. Now, the thing about a tax is who has to pay it? Is it the buyers paying it? Is it the sellers paying it? We're going to take a look at both scenarios and work our way through it. First, looking at a tax on buyers. A tax on buyers shifts the demand curve by the amount of the tax. Price would have to fall, the market price would have to fall by the per unit tax, in this case have to fall by $1.50 to make buyers willing to buy the same quantity as before the tax. So if price fell from $10 to $8.50 in our example here, buyers would still be willing to purchase 500 pizzas. And this would be the downward effect of the tax. Again, demand decreased due to the tax, and in order to still sell the same amount, the price of pizza would have to be $8.50. Subsequent slides, we're gonna have a couple different prices. We're gonna have price with a subscript of B, which denotes the price buyers pay, and then price subscript S, which denotes the price that sellers receive. So we're going to have PB and PS, just to try to illustrate situations where the buyer pays some tax and the seller pays some tax. Now, the government makes buyers in this situation pay $1.50 tax on each pizza they purchase. The new demand curve in red, labeled as D2, reflects the buyer's demand as a function of after-tax price. The original demand curve still reflects the buyer's demand as a function of the total price, inclusive of the tax. So thus, if you look at it in this way, the buyer's demand hasn't really changed. At each quantity, the height of the original blue demand curve is still the maximum the buyers are willing to pay for that quantity. While the height of the new red demand curve is the maximum that buyers will pay sellers for that quantity. Given the fact that they must also pay a tax. So at any quantity, the vertical distance between the blue and red demand curves equals the tax. If this were a percentage tax instead of a per unit tax, we're using a per unit tax for simplicity, the new demand curve would not be parallel to the old one, it would be flatter. A tax at a given percentage would be a larger dollar amount at higher prices than at lower prices, so the downward shift would be greater in absolute terms when the price is higher than when it is low. So this type of complexity we try to avoid by working with per unit taxes. Now in this scenario, let's say we have two different prices. Again, you have your demand curves here, your original $10 and 500 pizzas, and your original supply and demand. We have the tax, but in this situation, sellers receive a price of $9.50. Let's say they lowered their prices by 50 cents from $10 to $9.50, instead of going down to $8.50, or instead of staying where they were. And let's say buyers pay the difference, obviously, between the new price and then the tax. So they pay $11. $9.50 plus $1.50 is $11, and the difference again is the $1.50 tax. So the buyer is still paying the entire tax. However, the seller lowered their price slightly to $9.50, and that results in them selling 450 pizzas. Now, again, at that price, the buyers are going to want 450 pizzas, but the effect of the tax is the difference between the price that the seller charges and the price that the buyer is willing to pay. The incidence of a tax is how the burden of a tax is shared among market participants. In our example that we just gave, buyers pay $1 more. They pay $11 versus the original market equilibrium price of $10, and the sellers get 50 cents less. They get $9.50 instead of 10. So the market participants simply mean the buyers and the sellers make adjustments, and the new equilibrium is $4.50. So a tax does have an effect on how much of a good or service is sold. Now let's look at it in terms of the seller had to pay the tax on sellers. The tax effectively raises the seller's cost by $1.50 per pizza. So that if it's the seller paying the tax, the per unit tax of $1.50, it's essentially an input cost. For sellers to supply 500 pizzas, they'll only supply the 500 pizzas if the price rises to $11.50 to compensate for the cost increase. Because if the tax is put on the sellers and not as a sales tax on the consumers, it's an input cost for the pizza parlor. Hence, a tax on sellers shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. Okay, you see highlighted in green there. So price goes from an equilibrium of $10 and 500 pizzas. If they still want to sell 500 pizzas, that because of the shift in supply due to the tax, the difference here, they're going to have to charge $11.50 to be able to supply 500 pizzas. So the government makes sellers pay $1.50 on each pizza they sell. The new red supply curve reflects sellers, the seller supply as a function of the after-tax price. Looking at our second example, if the seller takes a different approach and the buyers pay $11 again for their pizza at the reduced supply, again we have the second supply curve here, and sellers receive $9.50. The difference again is the tax, $1.50. So that's the same. The outcome is the same in both cases. The effects on price and quantity and the tax incidence are the same whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. It's going to affect the market either way. You're going to have to maintain the same quantity. You're going to have to raise price and have to be willing to pay that price. Or if at a higher price, if you don't maintain that quantity, you're going to lose some quantity. So what matters is this: a tax drives a wedge between the price buyers pay and the sellers receive. It essentially disconnects the two. So whether government makes buyers or sellers pay the tax, all the effects are essentially the same. The price buyers pay rises, in this case to $11. The price sellers receive falls, in this case to $9.50. And the equilibrium quantity falls, in this case to $4.50. The incidence of the tax is the same. Here, buyers pay $1 of the tax, while sellers pay 50 cents of the tax on each unit. So again, all the effects are same. The buyers pay a higher price, the sellers receive less. Equilibrium quantity falls, and then the tax is going to be the same. That $1.50 per unit tax is always there. This should make sense if you think it through. A tax on buyers means buyers will have to pay more, which causes their demand to fall. The fall in demand hurts sellers, forcing them to reduce their price. A tax on sellers, on the other hand, is like a cost increase, and sellers pass along a portion of that increase to the buyers in the form of higher prices. We gave one example where they sent the whole cost onto them, and we gave one example where they sent only $1 of the $1.50 onto them. The equivalence of the taxes on buyers and sellers, the equivalence of taxes on buyers and taxes on sellers means that we can ignore whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. All that matters is the size of the tax. So in future problems, we can think of the tax as a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. On a supply and demand diagram, this wedge is the vertical line segment shown in green on this graph. You can think of it as taking a toothpick the size of the tax and wedging it between the supply and demand curves. The quantity at which the toothpick fits just snugly is the new equilibrium quantity. Okay, my students will have a chance to practice this as exercise, both in this. We're going to do an exercise in this video lecture here in the next few slides, and then also you have some applications at the back of your chapter you can work your way through as well. Someone once said, if you want less of something, tax it. A tax on any good or service causes a fall in its quantity. This is because people respond to incentives, one of the principles of economics, the first one in fact. The tax gives buyers an incentive to buy less and gives sellers an incentive to produce less. So if you want less of something, tax it. So we'll work through an example. These are the same supply and demand curves used in the previous exercise 1 that we did earlier in the slide set where we looked at hotel rooms, market for hotel rooms. Here you see the equilibrium price of 100 and quantity of 100. Now suppose the government imposes a tax on buyers of $30 per room. So find the new quantity, find the new price for buyers from the price for sellers, and the incidence of the tax. First, the equilibrium quantity is the quantity where the price of it's price buyers minus price sellers, and that's $30. So that's the incidence of the tax. The difference between 110 and 80 here is 30. This quantity is the equilibrium quantity is 80. Where that's the incidence of the tax, and then the quantity of rooms is going to be 80. Next, to find the price of buyers, you start at quantity 80 and you go up to the demand curve to see the price of buyer, the PB at 110. Okay, just go up to the demand. We're looking at buyers here, so that's demand is 110. And to find the price for the suppliers, we start at the quantity of 80 and we go up to the supply curve. And we find price sellers at 80. Okay, so 80, the price is $80 given the tax, and the quantity is 80. And then the price for buyers is 110 given the tax, and the quantity is 80. To find the incidence, we just compare PB to PS, and the no tax equilibrium price would be 100 at equilibrium here. So the tax is 30. And that's the difference between PS and PB, and the quantity given the tax is 80. So we've just seen the tax incidence is not affected by whether the government makes buyers or sellers pay the tax. So what then does determine the tax incidence? Well, it turns out it's elasticity, specifically the price elasticities of supply and demand. There are two cases. First, supply is more elastic than demand in this slide, at least it's a little flatter, and demand is more price elastic than supply in the next slide. So let's take a look at the first slide where supply is more price elastic than demand. When supply is more price elastic than demand, sellers are relatively more responsive to the changes in prices. There's a greater variability in terms of quantity. The supply curve is less steep than the demand curve in this example, meaning buyers have relatively fewer alternatives, so they have to quote-unquote eat most of the price increase caused by the imposition of the tax. As the textbook puts it, sellers can more easily leave the market in response to the tax than can buyers. Thus, buyers are stuck bearing most of the burden of the tax. So case 1, supply is more elastic than demand. It's easier for sellers than buyers to leave the market, so buyers bear most of the burden of the cost. So we see here there's the equilibrium, we see here the price if there's no tax. and supply and demand. But we look at above and beyond, above and below that price equilibrium. The space above, now the orange line is the incidence of the tax. The space above is bigger than the space below. The space above is the buyer's share of the tax burden, and the space below is the seller's share of the tax burden. And in this situation, with a more elastic supply, the buyers have a larger share than the sellers. Case 2, where demand is more elastic than supply. The size of the tax is the same in this diagram as the one on the preceding slide. There's still that same size tax. When demand is more price elastic than supply, buyers are relatively more price sensitive, and the demand curve is less steep than the supply curve. You see a pretty steep supply curve, and while it is a steep demand curve, it's flatter than the supply. Buyers have relatively more alternatives, so it's the opposite of the previous scenario. So they can avoid most of the tax. They just go somewhere else. Sellers are less flexible, so they have to quote unquote eat a greater share of the price increase caused by a tax. So, like the textbook says, buyers can more easily leave the market than sellers in response to a tax in this situation. Thus, the sellers end up with most of the burden of the tax. Again, you can look here at the market equilibrium where it would have been, the space above that to the price of the buyers versus the space below that price to the price of the sellers here. And the sellers are inheriting more of the burden. The entire area is the burden. This is what the buyers pay. This is what the sellers pay. The sellers in this scenario, because of flatter demand, more elastic demand, are paying more. And again, the incidence of the tax is represented here with the orange line. So let's take a look at a real-world example for the material you just learned and do a case study. Who pays the luxury tax? In 1990, Congress adopted a luxury tax on yachts, private airplanes, furs, expensive cars, etc. The goal was to raise revenue from those who can most easily afford to pay, aka wealthy consumers. But who really pays this tax? We see here a supply and demand. Demand is price elastic. In the short run, supply is pretty inelastic. Hence, the companies that build yachts pay most of the tax in this scenario. Again, we see the buyer's burden, tax burden here, and the seller's tax burden, and the seller's tax burden is bigger. So demand for yachts and other luxury items is price elastic. Remember, luxuries, you can take them or leave them. If the price of yachts rise, rich customers can easily avoid the tax by spending their millions on some other luxury item. The supply of yachts is less elastic, especially in the short run. I mean, what yachts are built, they're built. What yachts are being built will be finished being built. It's difficult for companies that build yachts to retool their factories and re-educate their workers to produce something other than a luxury yacht. It's pretty specific. Hence, the companies that build yachts pay most of the tax, and the rich pay relatively little of it. So the same is true for taxes on other luxury items. So again, policy can be quite economically inefficient when allocating and saying, hey, let's tax these rich people, and you end up taxing the less than rich people that are the yacht companies, and that affects their level of employees and so on and so forth when they're paying a higher cost. So let's take another look at an example. This is example 3 in the slide set. Prior to 2011, the Social Security payroll tax was 6.2% taken from workers' pay and 6.2% paid by employers. That's a total of 12.4%. So half paid by workers, half paid by employers. The Tax Relief Act of 2010 reduced the workers' portion from 6.2% to 4.2% in 2011, but left the employer's portion at 6.2%. So you're looking at 10.4% total Social Security payroll tax as a relief for workers, at least as an idea. So The Tax Act relief, if I'm recalling correctly, was signed into law by President Obama in December 2012. It contained several provisions, including a 2-year extension of the Bush tax cuts for all income levels and a temporary extension of unemployment insurance benefits. This Bush brought this in, well, I guess it was towards the end of his term, a lot of those, middle part of his term. A lot of those tax cuts, and then Obama continued them due to the prevalence of the Great Recession that occurred between the two administrations. Not great. I hope I didn't say Great Depression. That was something completely different. What I mean to say is Great Recession that occurred in the mid-2000s. This exercise focuses on a 1-year reduction in the Social Security payroll tax. So, going back to the Tax Relief Act that reduced the employer's workers' share from 6.2% to 4.2% of payroll taxes, but kept the employer's portion the same. Should this change have increased the typical worker's take-home pay by exactly 2%, more than 2%, or less than 2%? Let's find out. Do any elasticities affect your answer? We're going to explain. So let's explore this. This is real world, something economists do all the time, and something politicians never really seem to understand. So here's the possible answers. As long as labor supply and labor demand both have a price elasticity greater than 0, the tax cut will be shared by the workers and the employees. For example, workers' take-home pay will rise by less than 2%. The answer does not depend on whether the labor demand is more or less elastic than labor supply. So here's a follow-up question. Who gets the bigger share of this tax cut, workers or employers? How do elasticities determine the answer? Now, it might be helpful to remind you that the legal division of the tax, 6.2% for workers and 6.2% for employers, is irrelevant to the economic incidence of the tax. This means that workers' take-home pay depends only on the total amount of the tax, which is 12.4%, 6.2 plus 6.2, not the portion that's collected by from workers or employers. So it's just the overall total. So to help you understand the answer, if you wanted to, you can draw a supply and demand diagram for the labor market with a tax. You reduce the tax and see what happens to the equilibrium wages paid to the workers. You will find that they rise, but not by the full amount of the tax cut. Employers get a portion of the tax cut as well. So then we can consider this follow-up question. Who gets a bigger share of the tax cut, workers or employees? If labor demand is more elastic than labor supply, workers bear most of the burden of the tax. Reducing the tax, therefore, benefits workers more than employers. However, if labor demand is less elastic than supply, the reverse is true. If labor demand is more elastic than labor supply, if demand's more elastic than the supply of labor, workers get more of the tax cuts than employers. However, if demand is less elastic than the labor supply, employers get a larger share of the tax cut. So it all depends on the slope of that line, thus it all depends on the elasticity as to who gets more benefit. So in conclusion, government policies and allocation of resources. Each of the policies in this chapter affects the allocation of society's resources. Example 1, a tax on a pizza reduces the equilibrium quantity. With less production of pizza, resources like workers, ovens, and cheese and other inputs will be available to other industries. The second example, a binding minimum wage causes a surplus of workers and a waste of resources. You're not using all the workers in the market efficiently. So it's important for policymakers to apply such policies very carefully. Recall one of the 10 basic principles provided in Chapter 1 is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. This means that in the absence of market failures, which we will study in later chapters, the allocation of resources resulting from free market equilibrium is optimal. Hence, government policies that alter this allocation tend to make the economy worse off. When we study market failures later, we will see that government policies can, in principle, improve on the market's allocation of resources and make society better off. First, though, we need to learn how to measure the impact of government policies like taxes on society's well-being, as well as define what exactly we mean by quote-unquote well-being. This field of study is called welfare economics, and it's actually a topic in the following 3 chapters, which will be a focus on a survey course of economics or a microeconomics course. If you're in those tracks, you will see more of this. So in summary, a price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price of a good. An example is rent control. If the price ceiling is below the equilibrium price, it's binding and causes a shortage. A price floor is a minimum, a legal minimum on the price of a good. An example would be a minimum wage. If the price floor is above the equilibrium price, it's binding and causes a surplus. The labor surplus caused by minimum wage is unemployment. You have more workers than you have jobs. A tax on a good places a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive, and causes the equilibrium quantity to fall, whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. The incidence of a tax is the division of the burden of the tax between buyers and sellers. And it does not depend on whether the tax is imposed on buyers or sellers. There's still that incidence there. The incidence of a tax depends on the price elasticities of supply and demand. So the slopes of those curves depends on who inherits more of the tax. I would encourage you to probably listen to this lecture at least twice. Definitely do the reading and the homework. And let me know if you have any questions, and I'll try to work through them with you. This concludes the lecture on Chapter 6. Please let me know if you have any questions. As always, feel free to send me a message or drop by.